Hi guys, Luke LaFontaine here at Cold Steel. I thought I'd have a little fun and take you on a short trip through the 17th century. Let's start things off. What do all of these swords have in common? They're not all the same, they're all different swords. The thing these swords all had in common is they all coexisted during the 17th century. From different cultures, different parts of the world, but everybody was basically using these swords at the exact same time. The English mortuary sword, or back sword. This was more or less regulated to England. The mortuary sword and the mortuary hilt was an English sword. It did make its way around Europe a little bit, but this is primarily an English weapon. You found this in the 1600s during the English Civil Wars, and it's primarily a military weapon. It's not really so much of a civilian sword, but this is a classic basket hilt. Now, the difference between a basket hilt and a ring hilt or swept hilt, all these bars are vertical. The way the basket is built is by connecting vertical bars, which makes a basket, which makes it a basket hilt. If you look at the difference of something like this, with something like this isn't a basket. The only thing connecting the entire piece is the knuckle bow. But what this is a swept hilt or ring hilt, where I've got rings and plates which make up the guard and make up the rest of the hilt. This is probably the most popular hilt type of the 17th century, and I'm going to explain why. But getting back to this basket hilt, like I said, primarily a military weapon, but this coincided and coexisted with all of these other swords. So this is primarily an English sword, and it's a cut and thrust sword, primarily a cutting sword, and like I said, military use. The next sword is the Polish saber. Now, Polish saber is another really famous weapon in history. This was also existing during the 17th century. During the 1600s in Poland, this was your weapon of choice for nobility and common man alike. If you'll notice, it's got a thumb ring. So what did I say about ring guards? Almost all swords at some point or another, as they advanced, had ring guards for hand protection. The Polish saber winds up putting what's called a thumb ring on the inside of the guard to protect your thumb while fencing. The outside is open, but you're protected by the knuckle bow and the cross guard, and it's the thumb ring on the inside. The thumb ring actually also allows you to have manipulation of the blade. But this sword exists with the rest of these blades in the 17th century. This was more or less an ethnocentric weapon. This weapon didn't really leave Poland. It was in Poland, it was in surrounding areas, but it didn't jump continents. You didn't have something like this in Asia. You didn't have something like this in the rest of Europe, as per se France and England. This was a weapon of the Caucasus. It was a weapon that was favored by Poles, Hungarians, even the Turks. Really favored a saber. But this sword coexisted with straight-bladed rapiers, which were famous in the 17th century, which I'm going to get to next. This is a very well-known weapon because of Hollywood and the movies. This is a Cavalier Rapier, or a shell-guarded rapier. This existed in the 17th century, and it was what was basically called a transitional rapier. The reason being that it was called a transitional rapier, it was transitioning from a rapier eventually into a small sword. If you look at the way this is made, with the large shells and the supporting bars, eventually what happens is these shells get smaller, the rest of the bars go away, the quillion, the forward quillion goes away, the rear quillion gets really short, because fencing in the time period, they suddenly realized, I don't need all this stuff on the hilt anymore. I don't need this much hand protection. I'm a better swordsman. The science of swordsmanship is advanced. But in the 17th century, this was the romanticized weapon. You see films like The Three Musketeers and The Man in the Iron Mask. This was the weapon of the day. The rapier was primarily a civilian weapon, But this thing, everybody had one of these on their hip. It was an item of fashion as well as being a weapon. This was the fashionable thing to wear. You didn't go out in all your fancy gear and your nice outfit without having one of these hanging off of your hip. So it gained in massive popularity because it really was a statement of fashion and a statement of symbol. So although it is a period sword and people used it for dueling, this was also a huge fashion item. Like I said, this is a Cavalier Rapier. What makes it a Cavalier Rapier was carried by the Cavaliers of the period. When you get into the 1600s, you're no longer seeing swept hilt rapiers or rapiers with larger blades and hilts that are made up of bars. It becomes a closed guard, which becomes 2 shells and a bunch of supporting bars. Eventually, as I said, this turns into the cup hilt, which is the last revision of a rapier, where it turns into one solid cup for hand protection. And then basically with these small shells, everything shrinks and this turns into the courtly smallsword. Next is a variation on the Cavalier Rapier. This comes at the same time, but a little bit earlier. This is a shell-hilted rapier. You'll notice it's a lot bigger than the Cavalier because as you go back further in time, rapiers were longer. You have 3 basic periods to the rapier: early, middle, and late. This, I would say, is in between early and middle. This existed in the 17th century, in the early 1600s. You'll notice it's not a small sword. It's got a really long blade. We produced this blade. This has got a 41-inch blade on it. And in terms of a production, large numbers made sword, nobody makes a rapier blade this long. Custom makers do, but not an actual production sword. 41 inches of blade. It is spring tempered and stiff and razor sharp. This is a really nice example of a period sword. Like I said, when I'm talking about this being an item of fashion, this was a prestige piece. If you had money, this is like taking your Lamborghini out for a stroll, literally. Swords were incredibly expensive at the time, especially because every sword that was made back then was a custom one-off piece. This was a status symbol. If I was wearing this and I went to court, I went out in public, people admired it on my hip because it was worth a lot of money. Besides the fact that it was a tool and a weapon and a fully functional sword, it was also 100% a status symbol. So if you look at the difference of a sword like this and a sword like that, they're very different, but they existed at the exact same time period. Because this being more of a military weapon and this being more of a civilian weapon, it shows and dictates the difference of how people were wearing and using swords. So with all of these swords coexisting in the same time period, it shows you that the swordsman and man in general was really ingenious in terms of creating a whole bunch of different kinds of blades and a whole bunch of different kinds of swords that were all used in the same time period all across Europe. So there's your little trip through the 17th century. I hope you had fun. Go online and check out our sword collection, and otherwise keep checking out Cold Steel. Thanks for watching.